In the final days of June 1941, a message arrived at British headquarters in Cairo. The general who received it had given Britain something it desperately needed: victory. Only months earlier, his forces had torn through an Italian army many times their size. They had advanced hundreds of miles across the Libyan desert, captured entire divisions, taken 130,000 prisoners, and destroyed almost everything Mussolini had built in North Africa. At the same time, other armies under his command were dismantling Italy's empire in East Africa. Britain had spent more than a year retreating. France had fallen. Dunkirk had become a national myth built around a military disaster. Greece was collapsing. German aircraft were bombing British cities. Then one quiet, one-eyed general began winning. Now Winston Churchill was removing him from command. The man who had delivered Britain's first great victories of the Second World War was being sent away from the battlefield where he had achieved them. His name was Archibald Wavell, and the story of how he conquered an army, lost his command, and disappeared behind the legend of the men who followed him tells us something uncomfortable about military history. Victories are not always remembered according to who made them possible. Sometimes they belong to whoever arrives last. Archibald Percival Wavell was born in 1883 into a family that already understood the British Army. His father was a professional officer who eventually became a major general. There was little doubt about the direction of the boy's life. He attended Winchester College and then the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. In 1901, still only 17, he was commissioned into the Black Watch. Wavell was quiet, physically solid, and almost painfully reserved. He rarely used 10 words when 3 would do. His expression could appear severe even when he was relaxed, and the loss of one eye later made his stare seem even more intimidating. Wavell's first experience of war came in South Africa during the closing stages of the Second Boer War. It was not the kind of campaign celebrated in Victorian paintings. The British Army was fighting mobile Boer commandos across enormous distances, protecting railways, controlling territory, and learning how difficult it could be to defeat an enemy who refused to fight in the expected way. After South Africa came service in India and operations on the northwest frontier. These early postings taught Wavell lessons that would later matter in the desert. Distance could be as dangerous as enemy fire. A force that could not be supplied could not fight. Maps were never as reliable as officers imagined, and an apparently weaker enemy could become dangerous if British commanders underestimated terrain, movement, or morale. Wavell attended Staff College and spent a year in Russia as a military observer. Unlike officers who remained inside the comfortable traditions of their own regiment, he studied foreign armies, languages, organization, and strategy. When the First World War began in 1914, Wavell served first as a staff officer and then as brigade major of the 9th Infantry Brigade. In 1915, during the Second Battle of Ypres, a shell fragment struck him in the face. He lost his left eye. The injury would have ended the career of many officers. Wavell returned to duty. He received the Military Cross and continued serving in a series of important staff appointments. He worked in the Caucasus as a liaison officer with Russian forces. He served in the Middle East with General Edmund Allenby's Egyptian Expeditionary Force. Later, he worked at the Supreme War Council in Versailles. He saw the war from several different levels: the mud and violence of the front line, the movement of armies across continents, and the political negotiations behind military decisions. Wavell was not only a soldier. He possessed an extraordinary memory for poetry and could recite long passages from English verse. Years later, he would publish an anthology called Other Men's Flowers, assembled largely from poems he knew by heart. The poetry reveals the part of Wavell that his severe appearance concealed. He understood courage, death, duty, loneliness, and the private cost of command. He simply did not discuss those things easily in his own words. Between the wars, Wavell continued moving through staff and field appointments. He commanded an infantry brigade and later the 2nd Division. He served as an aide-de-camp to King George VI. In 1937, he was sent to command British forces in Palestine and Transjordan during a period of violent political unrest. The assignment demanded more than battlefield tactics. Wavell had to coordinate military operations, intelligence, civil authorities, and police forces, while dealing with political problems no army could solve by force alone. In August 1939, only weeks before Britain declared war on Germany, Wavell was appointed General Officer Commanding-in-Chief of Middle East Command. The title sounded impressive. The resources behind it were not. Wavell's responsibility eventually stretched across an extraordinary area: Egypt, Palestine, Sudan, East Africa, Aden, Iraq, the Persian Gulf, Greece, and parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. From Cairo, he was expected to protect the Suez Canal, Britain's communications with India and Asia, the oil routes of the Middle East, and territories covering millions of square miles. He did not have enough soldiers to defend all of them. He did not have enough tanks. He did not have enough modern aircraft. He did not have enough transport. And if Italy entered the war, Wavell would face large enemy forces in Libya to the west and Italian East Africa to the south. Italian propaganda presented its army as a modern imperial force ready to sweep through Egypt, seize the Suez Canal, and drive Britain out of the Mediterranean. In Libya, Marshal Rodolfo Graziani commanded an army containing hundreds of thousands of men. In Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Italian Somaliland, the Duke of Aosta controlled another large colonial force. Wavell's troops were scattered across several countries. Many of his formations were incomplete. Equipment arrived slowly from Britain because the country was preparing for a possible German invasion. The obvious response was to remain on the defensive. Wavell intended to do something else. He understood that the Italian advantage was impressive only while it remained organized and supplied. Italian armies depended on long roads running through empty desert. Their units varied sharply in quality. Their commanders were cautious, communications were weak, and much of their equipment was already outdated. Wavell could not defeat Italy by matching its numbers. He would have to make those numbers irrelevant. Italy declared war on Britain and France on June 10, 1940. Within hours, British forces began small raids across the Egyptian-Libyan frontier. These operations did not decide the campaign, but they unsettled the Italians and gave British patrols experience of the ground. Wavell encouraged initiative. He wanted aggressive reconnaissance, mobile columns, and commanders who could operate without waiting for detailed instructions from Cairo. One of those commanders was Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor. O'Connor led the Western Desert Force, the formation responsible for defending Egypt against the Italian army in Libya. He was energetic, flexible, and willing to take risks. This distinction matters because later retellings sometimes turn Operation Compass into the achievement of one man. It was not. O'Connor was the operational commander whose leadership drove the offensive forward. His divisional commanders and soldiers executed it. But Wavell created the opportunity, selected the commanders, accepted the risk, and protected the operation at the strategic level. In September 1940, the Italian 10th Army crossed the frontier and advanced into Egypt. British troops withdrew ahead of it. To an observer in London, the withdrawal could look like weakness. To Wavell, it was space being exchanged for advantage. The Italians moved approximately 60 miles into Egypt before halting around Sidi Barrani. Instead of continuing toward the main British positions, they constructed a series of fortified camps spread across the desert. The camps were strong individually. Together they were vulnerable. Wide gaps separated them. The formations inside could not easily support one another. Supplies had to travel along a long, exposed route from Libya. The Italian army had advanced far enough to weaken itself, but not far enough to achieve anything decisive. Wavell saw the opening. He approved a plan for a short British attack intended to last about 5 days. Officially, it was described almost like a large raid. Its codename was Operation Compass. The British force numbered roughly 36,000 men. It included the 4th Indian Division, the 7th Armoured Division, and supporting units. Facing them was an Italian force several times larger. A conventional attack would have been suicidal. The British therefore prepared in secrecy. Vehicles moved at night. Aircraft attempted to prevent Italian reconnaissance. Troops practiced crossing the desert and navigating without obvious landmarks. Engineers prepared water and supply arrangements. British commanders studied the spaces between the Italian camps rather than concentrating only on the camps themselves. Instead of attacking the Italians where they appeared strongest, the British would move through the gaps and strike them from directions they did not expect. The operation began before dawn on December 9, 1940. British and Indian troops approached the Italian camp at Nibeiwa from the west, the side considered least vulnerable because it faced away from Egypt. Heavy Matilda infantry tanks moved with them. The Matilda was slow, but against many Italian anti-tank weapons, it was frighteningly difficult to stop. The attack achieved surprise. Italian positions that had been designed to face east suddenly found British armor and infantry inside or behind their defenses. Command structures broke down. Units became isolated. Men surrendered in large numbers. Nibeiwa fell. Other camps followed. The Western Desert Force struck through the Italian positions around Sidi Barrani, cutting communications and preventing an organized response. What had been planned as a 5-day operation became something much larger. The Italian army was not merely retreating, it was coming apart. Wavell faced a decision. He could stop after achieving the original objective, secure Egypt, and avoid stretching his limited force. That would have been a respectable result. Or he could allow O'Connor to continue into Libya. Every mile west increased the danger. Fuel, food, ammunition, spare parts, and water had to follow the advancing troops. Vehicles broke down in the desert. Units became separated by enormous distances. Reinforcements were limited, but the enemy was collapsing. Wavell chose to continue. British, Indian, and Australian forces crossed into Libya. In January 1941, they attacked Bardia, a fortified port defended by a large Italian garrison. More than 35,000 prisoners were taken. Tobruk came next. It too fell, bringing another huge surrender and giving the British a valuable harbour through which supplies could move. O'Connor's troops pushed west across Cyrenaica, while Italian formations attempted to escape toward Tripolitania. British armour moved across difficult inland routes to cut them off. The decisive moment came near Beda Fomm. The retreating Italian 10th Army was moving along the coastal road towards safety. A British mobile force crossed the desert and reached the road ahead of it. The Italians found their escape blocked. For several days they tried to break through. They had more men and, in some areas, more tanks. But their columns were compressed along the road, their command system was failing, and British guns and armour occupied the ground they needed to cross. On February 7, 1941, organised resistance collapsed. The Italian 10th Army had effectively ceased to exist. In approximately 2 months, Wavell's forces had advanced around 500 miles. 9 Italian divisions had been destroyed. About 130,000 prisoners had been captured, together with hundreds of tanks and enormous quantities of artillery, transport, and supplies. The British losses were remarkably small compared with the scale of the victory. This was not simply another successful battle. It was Britain's first major land victory of the war. France had fallen. Across Europe, Axis power appeared almost unstoppable. Then Wavell's small, improvised force destroyed an army several times its size. It proved that Axis forces could be beaten. He was not the passive, cautious officer some politicians imagined. He was willing to accept enormous risks when the military conditions justified them. That difference would become central to his conflict with Churchill. Even as Operation Compass was transforming the war in Libya, Wavell was fighting another campaign more than 1,000 miles away. Italian East Africa consisted of Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland. From this territory, Italian forces threatened Sudan, Kenya, British Somaliland, the Red Sea, and the route linking Britain to the Middle East and Asia. Wavell helped plan a multi-directional offensive. Forces advanced from Sudan into Eritrea and Ethiopia. Others moved north from Kenya into Italian Somaliland. Operations from the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden added pressure from another direction. The terrain was entirely different from Libya. In the Western Desert, armies fought across open ground where armor and movement dominated. In East Africa, troops faced mountains, narrow passes, poor roads, tropical disease, and supply lines running through some of the most difficult country in the world. At Keren in Eritrea, Italian defenders occupied strong mountain positions blocking the route toward Asmara and the Red Sea port of Massawa. British and Indian troops fought for weeks through steep ravines and rocky heights. Eventually, the defenders were forced back. To the south, Allied forces advanced rapidly through Italian Somaliland and into Ethiopia. Addis Ababa fell. Emperor Haile Selassie returned from exile. By the middle of 1941, Mussolini's East African Empire had been broken. Wavell had overseen victories in two enormous African theaters, while also watching Iraq, Palestine, the Persian Gulf, and the Eastern Mediterranean. This is where the title becomes understandable. He had not personally conquered every battlefield in Africa. No general could. His victories belonged equally to O'Connor, William Platt, Alan Cunningham, Indian divisions, Australian formations, African troops, South Africans, New Zealanders, British units, and countless officers whose names never became famous. But Wavell had directed the wider war. He had taken inferior resources and created local superiority at the moments that mattered. And he gave Britain victories when almost nobody else was giving Britain anything except explanations for defeat. Then the strategic picture changed. Britain was not fighting only Italy. In October 1940, Mussolini invaded Greece from Albania. The Greek army resisted and drove the Italians back. For Britain, Greece presented both an opportunity and a danger. Supporting the Greeks might create a Balkan front against the Axis. It might encourage Yugoslavia and Turkey to resist German pressure. It might place British aircraft closer to Romanian oil fields important to Hitler's war machine. It might also become a trap. Churchill was emotionally and politically committed to helping Greece. He believed Britain could not abandon a country that was actively resisting invasion. Wavell understood the argument. He also understood the military cost. The British advance in Libya had not finished. Tripoli remained in Axis hands. O'Connor believed that with additional time and resources, his force might continue west and drive the Italians out of North Africa. But the army that had achieved Operation Compass was exhausted. Its tanks were worn down, vehicles required repair, units needed reinforcement. Now some of its best formations and equipment were being considered for Greece. Wavell opposed weakening the desert campaign before the position in North Africa had been secured. But he was a serving commander. When the government made the decision, he obeyed. Experienced troops, aircraft, tanks, and transport began moving toward Greece. The 6th Australian Division and the New Zealand Division were among the formations committed. British armour was also diverted. At almost exactly the same moment, Germany intervened in North Africa. Erwin Rommel arrived in Tripoli in February 1941 with the first elements of the Afrika Korps. His formal instructions were limited. He was expected to stabilize the Italian position. Rommel had no intention of waiting. He examined the weakened British forces in front of him and recognized an opportunity. Many of the troops remaining in Cyrenaica were inexperienced. British tanks were dispersed, worn out, or being sent elsewhere. Supply lines extended hundreds of miles from Egypt. The army that had destroyed the Italians was no longer the army guarding the ground it had captured. Rommel attacked in March. The British position collapsed with shocking speed. Units withdrew eastward. Headquarters lost contact with formations. The desert once again turned distance into an enemy. During the retreat, Richard O'Connor was captured by a German patrol. Within weeks, most of the territory gained during Operation Compass had been lost. Only Tobruk remained in Allied hands, defended mainly by Australian troops and surrounded by Axis forces. From London, the reversal looked like a failure of command. From Cairo, it looked like the consequence Wavell had feared. He had been ordered to fight several campaigns with forces that could barely sustain one. The crisis did not end in Libya. In April 1941, Germany invaded Yugoslavia and Greece. British and Commonwealth forces in Greece were overwhelmed by the speed and power of the German offensive. They withdrew toward evacuation ports, leaving tanks, guns, vehicles, and supplies behind. Many were taken to Crete. In May, German airborne forces attacked the island. Crete also fell after bitter fighting. At almost the same time, a pro-Axis coup in Iraq threatened British oil interests and the air route across the Middle East. Wavell had to find forces for Iraq. Then British troops invaded Syria and Lebanon, which were controlled by authorities loyal to Vichy France. Wavell had to support that operation too. North Africa, East Africa, Greece, Crete, Iraq, Syria, Palestine, the Suez Canal. All of them passed through the same command. There were not enough soldiers, aircraft, ships, or vehicles to satisfy every demand. Wavell's headquarters became a place where military necessity collided daily with political urgency. Churchill wanted action. That was one of Churchill's greatest strengths. He refused passivity. He demanded that commanders search constantly for ways to strike the enemy. It could also become a serious weakness. Churchill was far from the battlefield. He saw maps, reports, and numbers. Wavell saw exhausted formations, broken tanks, incomplete training, and roads along which every gallon of fuel had to travel. The two men communicated badly. Wavell replied with short, restrained messages that could sound evasive or pessimistic. He often failed to explain fully what he was thinking. To Wavell, a professional assessment should speak for itself. Churchill demanded an effort to relieve Tobruk and push Rommel back. Wavell first launched Operation Brevity in May 1941. It achieved limited gains but could not transform the position. A larger operation followed in June, Operation Battleaxe. The plan was to defeat Axis forces near the Egyptian-Libyan frontier, relieve Tobruk, and recover the initiative. British armoured units had received new tanks, but crews had limited time to train with them. Mechanical reliability remained a problem. Coordination between tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft was still uneven. Rommel had prepared strong anti-tank positions. German 88mm guns could destroy British tanks at ranges from which many British weapons struggled to reply. Churchill wanted the attack quickly. Wavell launched it on June 15, 1941. For 3 days, British forces attacked around Halfaya Pass, Fort Capuzzo, and the frontier positions. They achieved some initial success. Then German defenses held. British tanks advanced into anti-tank fire. Coordination broke down. Rommel shifted his forces and threatened the British flank. The operation was abandoned. Battleaxe had failed. The losses were not on the scale of France or Greece, but politically the defeat was devastating. Churchill had expected the new tanks and concentrated effort to produce victory. Instead, Tobruk remained surrounded and Rommel remained in control of the initiative. For Wavell, this was the final blow. Churchill decided that Middle East Command needed new leadership. On June 21st, he informed Wavell that General Claude Auchinleck would replace him. Wavell would exchange appointments with Auchinleck and become Commander-in-Chief in India. The change took effect on July 1st, 1941. But there was no disguising what had happened. He had been removed from the theatre where he had won Britain's first great land victories. Was Wavell fired for winning Africa? Not literally. History is rarely that clean. Churchill did not remove him because Operation Compass had succeeded. He removed him because the situation had reversed, because Battleaxe had failed, because he had lost confidence in Wavell's ability to regain the initiative, and because their working relationship had become increasingly strained. Wavell also made mistakes. He delegated heavily and did not always impose enough coordination on subordinates. He underestimated how quickly Rommel would attack. The command structure in Cyrenaica was weak after O'Connor's advance. British forces were allowed to become dispersed and vulnerable. During Battleaxe, the coordination of armor and infantry was inadequate. Wavell accepted an offensive before his formations were fully prepared, even though the political pressure was intense. His communication with London was often too brief. He understood the problems in his theatre, but he did not always make Churchill understand them. Many of the conditions that led to his failure had been created by decisions he opposed. His strongest forces had been divided between North Africa, Greece, Crete, Iraq, Syria, and East Africa. The advance toward Tripoli had been halted. Experienced formations had been moved away. Equipment lost in Greece could not be replaced immediately. Then Wavell was judged for failing to maintain the position those decisions had weakened. That does not make Churchill a villain. The decision to aid Greece had political and moral logic. Britain was trying to maintain alliances, demonstrate resolve, and prevent the Balkans from falling completely under Axis control. No one in London possessed perfect knowledge of what Germany would do next. But the result remains difficult to ignore. Wavell was ordered to interrupt a successful offensive. The diverted expedition failed. Rommel exploited the weakened front. Churchill demanded a rapid recovery. When that recovery failed, Wavell paid the price. There is another reason his reputation faded. The North African campaign did not end with Wavell. Auchinleck stopped Rommel at the First Battle of El Alamein in July 1942. Then Bernard Montgomery took command of the 8th Army and won the Second Battle of El Alamein in October. Montgomery understood publicity in a way Wavell never did. The names El Alamein and Montgomery became inseparable. Wavell's victories belonged to an earlier, more confused phase of the war. His army was not yet called the 8th Army. His greatest opponent was initially the Italian command, rather than Rommel at full strength. His conquests were partly lost after he achieved them. The men who came later received the final scene. Wavell received the unfinished beginning. Even his personality worked against his memory. He did not build a public legend around himself. He did not write memoirs designed to defeat rivals on paper. He did not place himself naturally at the center of every success. Wavell understood that Operation Compass belonged to O'Connor and the soldiers who fought it. He knew that the East African victories belonged to commanders and troops spread across thousands of miles. The transfer to India did not bring Wavell peace. Within months, Japan entered the war. Wavell found himself responsible for another enormous under-resourced theater. He became Supreme Commander of the short-lived American-British-Dutch-Australian Command, attempting to coordinate forces across Southeast Asia as Japanese armies advanced through Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines. Singapore fell in February 1942 in the largest surrender of British-led forces in history. The ABDA command was dissolved soon afterward. Wavell returned to his role as Commander-in-Chief in India. In Burma, British and Allied forces conducted a desperate retreat toward India through terrible terrain and weather. One of Wavell's most important decisions was bringing William Slim from the Middle East to help command during the retreat. Slim would later rebuild the army in Burma and become one of Britain's greatest commanders. In January 1943, Wavell was promoted to Field Marshal. That fact alone complicates the idea that Churchill had simply thrown him away. Wavell remained respected, useful, and trusted with immense responsibilities. Later that year, he became Viceroy and Governor-General of India. India was experiencing famine, political conflict, wartime pressure, and growing demands for independence. Wavell attempted to increase relief efforts during the Bengal famine, and later tried to find a political path between the British government, the Indian National Congress, and the Muslim League. Once again, he became trapped between problems larger than the authority given to him. In 1947, Prime Minister Clement Attlee replaced him with Lord Mountbatten as Britain moved toward Indian independence and partition. Wavell returned to Britain and was created Earl Wavell. He died in 1950. By then, the public story of the Second World War had already begun to settle into familiar shapes. Wavell occupied an uncertain place in memory. Wavell's achievement was not that he personally directed every tank at Beda Fomm or every battalion in the mountains of Eritrea. His achievement was strategic. He controlled an immense theater with inadequate forces and competing demands. He accepted retreat when retreat created an advantage. He attacked when enemy numbers concealed operational weakness. He trusted aggressive subordinates. He understood that logistics shaped the limits of every plan. Even his enemies respected him. Rommel reportedly carried a copy of Wavell's lectures on generalship during the Desert Campaign. The commander whose arrival helped end Wavell's Middle Eastern career was studying Wavell's ideas about command. His quiet manner sometimes became poor leadership at the political level. Senior command requires explanation as well as judgment. It is not enough to be right privately. A commander must persuade governments, allies, and subordinates. He could appear tired and pessimistic. His headquarters sometimes lacked firm control over rapidly changing operations. His willingness to delegate gave talented men freedom, but it could also leave weaker commanders without enough direction. He had won against the Italians, but Germany changed the nature of the Desert War. Rommel's speed, tactical aggression, and integration of armor with anti-tank guns created a challenge Wavell's forces were not yet prepared to meet. But Wavell's removal still exposes the brutal unfairness of wartime command. A general may be judged not only by the decisions he makes, but by the consequences of decisions imposed upon him. He may create a victory and then be blamed when its gains cannot be held. He may be ordered to divide his forces and then criticized because they are too weak. He may be praised as a genius in February and replaced in June. That is what happened to Archibald Wavell. But he gave Britain its first major victories of the Second World War, oversaw the destruction of Mussolini's armies across 2 African theaters, and was removed from Middle East Command only months later. To Wavell, command was preparation, choosing the right subordinate, accepting an unpopular retreat, and making surprise, movement, and organization turn smaller forces into decisive victory. That was how Wavell won, and perhaps that was why he was so easy to replace. He received his orders. He handed over command. Britain remembered the generals who finished the Desert War. It largely forgot the general who proved that it could be won. Before Montgomery became the hero of El Alamein, before the Eighth Army became one of the most famous formations in British history, before Rommel became the legendary Desert Fox, Archibald Wavell had already shattered an Axis army in Africa. He gave a defeated nation evidence that victory was still possible. Then Britain sent him away. What surprised you most about Wavell's story, and do you think he deserves to be remembered alongside Britain's more famous wartime commanders? Subscribe for more true stories of the forgotten generals who fought Britain's wars and lost the credit.